Today on Solutions for Mental Wellness, we have Terence Dawkins with us. Terence is a compassionate and dedicated licensed independent social worker in clinical practice from Spartanburg, South Carolina. Terence achieved his undergraduate degree and his master's degree in social work from Winthrop University. This empowered him with the knowledge and the skills to excel in our profession. He is completely rooted, deeply rooted in his community that he grew up in, which is Spartanburg, South Carolina. And he has a private practice there called Missing Pieces Counseling Services. But that's not where your aspirations ended. You have gone on to serve, and you're also at Furman University in their counseling center there. And you're currently serving on the advisory board for, I want to make sure I get this right, wellness and recovery retreats. And we actually met at one of the retreats. You and I both were speaking there. And so I remember you made such an impression on me and how well you spoke to the participants and just the kindness that you were showing everyone. And so I was like, oh, I've got to get to know him better. And so when we were thinking about guests we wanted to have on the podcast, I absolutely wanted to sit down to get to know you better and also to hear a little bit more about the topic that you were talking about there, which is transgenerational trauma. So you and I both speak publicly, and we both are professionals in our mental health fields. And so today I want this conversation to be a little bit more relaxed and real. And so we're not necessarily taking off our therapist hats. We're just going to deliver our information in a way that anybody listening or watching can hear it. So tell me a little bit about what you mean by transgenerational trauma.
So transgenerational trauma is the passing of trauma throughout generations, and it can also be referred to as intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma is between passing of parent and child, so caregiver and child. But then transgenerational trauma can go back further generations. So trans means across generations. Inter is probably more
like between?
Between, yes.
Okay. So it sounds like the things that my grandparents struggled with is going to have an effect on my parents, which means it's going to affect me, which means that could potentially have an effect on the relationship I have with my parents. Am I understanding that correctly?
Relationship you have on your parents, and then how it gets passed to, if you have children, your children, and mainly how you interact and engage with the world or people and environments too.
Okay. So how did you come to develop this passion for transgenerational trauma?
Well, it started two ways.
Okay.
The first way was I was on the phone with my sister one day, and we was just having a random conversation, and I heard that she was yelling at one of her children in the background, but it was just because they asked her a question, and I guess she was irritated at something, and she started to yell at them. And it made me really start to think about how is that child really interpreting what she's saying, and how is it making that child feel when it just was like, hey, I just came to ask mom a simple question and then I get yelled at. And so now that child could possibly learn, I can't go talk to mom. And,
oh, wow.
Or if I talk to mom, I don't know what kind of reaction I'm going to get, which might discourage me from talking to her. So it started with that. And then I read this book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And in that book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome.
Oh, wow.
Yes, it's by Dr. Joy DeGruy.
Okay.
And that book talked about how aspects from slavery are still showing up today, but it then is interpreted and shown differently. And an example of that would be something as protecting a child from being harmed, or protecting a child from being, kidnapped or anything like that. And that child would always have to stand right beside the parent. That child would then say, oh, I can't go play like other children. There must be something wrong with me. And then the parent is more trying to protect it. But now if you look at it, if parents say, "Oh, you need to stand beside me at all times," it's more like control rather than protection. I mean, it could be both, but doesn't have the same context as it did before. And I just wanted to learn more about it from there.
Yeah, wow. It sounds like that was a really good book. Would you recommend that book for our listeners and viewers? Okay.
Yep.
So one of the things that stands out to me is that you had an observation of one of your family members, and it just ignited something within you to understand how does that child feel. And so I would label that empathy. You are having empathy for your niece or nephew.
Yeah.
And when we have empathy for someone else, that is healthy.
It is.
So what does transgenerational trauma, how does that affect empathy?
That's a very good question. I think it could be based off of, if you don't know, then you can't show. I like to put it that way. If you don't know, you can't show. So if parents never showed me how to have empathy, or showed me how to care for others, or be put in the shoes of other people, then I don't know exactly what that looks like for me to display it to someone else. So with me personally, my mom, sometimes she could be emotionally unavailable. And if I was allowed that to impact my life today, that would then make me sometimes be emotionally unavailable for people, meaning I wouldn't know how they felt, or I couldn't understand how they felt. But after learning about this concept, I've made different changes to try to, I guess, help improve that.
Yeah. So you've seen even within yourself how when we see something in someone else that it can impact us and we can grow. Wow.
Yeah.
It sounds like you took that experience and you really expanded your knowledge on it and want to share with others. What are some other things you'd like our listeners to hear today about transgenerational trauma?
Well, my clients, or even people in general who I encounter, they come and they always have the question of what's wrong with me, or they
Yes,
try to
I
think
hear that
about
too.
a lot, right? Like, what's wrong with me? Why am I reacting this way? Why am I always doing this? And the key word is always. Why am I always? And that's more of blaming yourself for what is happening or what you're doing. And I'm not saying people shouldn't take personal responsibility for the actions at all, but if you start to notice different patterns within yourself and different behaviors, or patterns with your emotions, I like to tell my clients that it probably didn't start with you.
Yes.
And that's actually another book, actually. So it
Okay.
didn't start with you.
Okay. And
Yes.
so would you recommend that for our viewers?
I highly recommend that book because it takes you through a journey of understanding the different patterns, understanding where they might have originated from, and also giving you kind of some solutions to heal and work through those. And so I always like to try to tell my clients and show them it did not start with you. So I ask them, how is your relationship with your parents, and specifically, how's your relationship with mom first, and then dad? And then I ask, do you know how their relationship was with their mom and their dad? And try to, take it back a little bit. And then I'll start making connections. Well, you see how mom did this, or how mom didn't do this,
Yes.
and how she didn't receive this. So how can she show you this, or how can you know what this is?
Yes. So it sounds like it helps people build compassion. So when we're taking a look back at the generations that came before us, we can develop empathy and compassion for ourselves and for our parents and grandparents.
Yeah.
Compassion is a powerful tool because when we can show compassion to ourselves, healing can begin.
Yes.
So how have you seen healing take place with your clients when you consider transgenerational trauma?
Well, when you ask me that, to be honest, the healing actually started with me personally.
Okay.
And then it transitioned to healing with my clients. Because like you said, once I had that observation of the circumstance with my sister and my niece and nephew, it made me do some inner work. So I
Yes.
had to be able to do the healing so I can know what that feels like and what that looks like so I can then show my clients. And what that looks like is developing boundaries. So one of the things that growing up my mom always told me was family is all that you've got. And I understand what she meant by that, but the way I interpreted it was anytime family needs you, you should be available. You need to do what you can to support family because we're all that we have. But it started to become an issue when I would neglect things for myself and put aside everything I had going on to try to help family. And so I had to start creating some boundaries there and let them know I'm still here to support and help, but only when I can do it or when I'm available. So I started letting them know, hey, I can do it, but this is when I can, or this is how I can help, instead of trying to worry myself and get all anxious about trying to help. So the healing started with me, and then that's when it's transferred to my clients. And what that looked like was, like you said, just having compassion for my parents, realizing all the resentment maybe that I had towards them, or some of the anger I probably had towards them. You start to see that decrease because now I can understand they couldn't give me what I wanted because they never had it.
Yes.
So it kind of, you start to see a smooth transition of how they talk about their parents or how they talk about different situations. And once you develop that awareness of where things started, then you start to slowly make transition of changes in your daily life, whether that's with relationships or things at work or how you respond to people or situations.
Yeah. You're saying that it's important that as therapists, we do our own work. I agree. I have a very similar experience to yours. And so when I do put down boundaries, it was incredibly hard for me. But most recently, when I returned to therapy as a client, my therapist really worked on with honoring my needs, my emotions, but also seeing that my parents behaved and were as they were because of the hard places that they came from in life too. So we have that similarity there. We share that.
And even with my work with my therapist, we're working on, I think it's identity, right?
Yes.
So my identity was always tied to my family. It was always tied to my family because, again, family is all that we've got. So I believe as children, we're shaped by our caregivers, we're shaped by our parents because they are supposed to teach us how to navigate the world.
Yeah.
And so
Scripture and science say that.
exactly. So we kind of transition from not our own thinking, but the thinking and views of our parents, and then life experiences help transition to our own thinking. But if you really sit down and reflect on it, it all started with what did our parents show us and what did they tell us? And then how did we interpret what they showed and what they were showing us and what they were telling us?
Yeah. One of the basic tenets of marriage and family therapy is all behavior makes sense in context. And I know that academically, and I've used that with my clients for years. But applying that in my own life and to my own family has been helpful. I do have 2 adult sons, and when I look back on parenting them, I can see how I gave them messages that I was given. And I've had to go back and ask for forgiveness to my children because I don't want them to carry the trauma, the weight, the shame that I've experienced on to their children. Neither one are married yet, but hoping. I want to be a grandma one day.
Listen,
so I'm hoping.
I'm not married either, and I'm hoping myself, and I'm pretty sure my mom's hoping for marriage and grandchildren too. And when you were mentioning how you went from thinking about how you were showing those messages to your sons, then I immediately thought about how my grandmother probably didn't graduate high school. She didn't have a lot of education like a lot of people's grandparents probably didn't back in that time. And so she would then teach my mom, education is important. You gotta get your education, you gotta make good grades. So what did my mom do? She kind of instilled, you need to perform in school. If you don't, you're going to get in trouble.
Yes.
And I can remember I missed honor roll 2 times in my whole grade school career.
Wow.
And each time was by 1 point.
Ooh,
And each time,
how did that go when you went home?
it was fine. To my surprise, it was fine.
Good.
But as a child, we're always thinking, hey, I got to perform because my parents always told me I got to make good grades. Don't you bring home a bad grade. Don't you act up in school. And so now when I get a C, it was more of I started getting anxiety about taking home the report card or anxiety about her going to the parent-teacher conference because I didn't meet the expectations that she had of me and I don't know what's going to happen. But where did that all start from? My anxiety surrounded around performing probably started with my grandmother teaching my mom how important education was because she didn't have it.
Yeah. So it sounds like it was a value that your grandmother had, that because she didn't get to fulfill that expectation she had for herself, she projected that onto your mom, who projected that onto you.
Yep. And again, the intention was I want you to be successful. But how did I interpret that? If I don't perform, it's bad, I get in trouble. So I always teach that. The intention is probably very different than the interpretation of how the child.
And that's really important to pull apart because we can believe wrong things. We can believe I don't matter unless I perform. We can believe I have to earn my way to have a seat at the table. We can believe these things that aren't true, and we can receive those messages, but that wasn't the original intent.
Nope.
And so transgenerational trauma, when we consider that, then it sounds like instead of blaming the parents and the grandparents, it actually is a way to understand and cultivate empathy and compassion.
Yes. Yes, I think that's the two things that I try to teach: empathy and compassion. Because, like I said, we get angry because that we didn't receive something, or we get angry because of how they did show up for us. But we don't never take the time to think about, well, what happened to them. We always talk about what happened to us or why am I this way. But first off, we don't think about what happened to us. We always think about what's going on now. And then two, we don't think about what happened to our parents or what happened to our grandparents to make them show up like that in that way for us.
If you could sum up just an overview of transgenerational trauma and the benefits of someone doing their own work when it comes to transgenerational trauma, what would you tell our listeners today?
I want them to know that this is a cycle, but this is a cycle that can be broken. But somebody has to break the cycle. Somebody has to be that person to say, I'm not going to pass this on. I'm not going to live like this anymore. Because what's been happening is we've just been taking what is and running with it. So if I could sum it up, of the benefits, it would be, number one, you could heal for some of the negative patterns that you have in, again, relationships that you have at work or that you have with your own children. And then two, you can stop that from being passed down to your children, and they won't continue to take that pattern, and you're breaking a cycle. If I have an anxious attachment style, I truly want to be connected and I truly want to be loved, but I start to become very hyper aware of small things. So if someone was to text me every morning and tell me good morning, the first day that they do not, my alarm system goes off and says something's wrong, you need to fix it, and you need to explore it. So now it could lead to an interrogation of that person of why did you change your behavior? What did I do? As we start to, in a way, bug them. And that could be overwhelming for someone. And then guess what's going to happen? We want them to talk to us, but since we're overwhelming them with all these questions because we're anxious,
pushing them away.
We're pushing them away.
Yeah.
So it keeps me, I really want it, but it keeps me from getting what I want.
Because I'm so afraid I'm going to lose it.
Exactly.